Hi, I'm Jim.
And I'm Michael.
This podcast is called Rising Above: Trauma, Addiction, and Culture in a Crazy World. In this podcast, I will interview Michael, a best-selling author who is working on a new book about his childhood and trauma. We will discuss personal experiences with trauma, memory, and memoir writing. Michael will read an excerpt of his essay, Everybody Wants to Rule the World, A Letter to My Younger Self, and I'll ask him some questions related to trauma and memory. For example, how does trauma affect memory? How does one write about it? This episode will range from the nitty-gritty of experience, deprivation, and abuse to more intellectual discussions of the research around memory and trauma. Michael and I are both in therapy and 12-step recovery, so we may use some of the 12-step framework in our discussion. Okay, are we ready to go?
We are
Hi,
ready to
Michael.
go. Hey, Jim, how are you?
Good, good. And so, yeah, I was excited to read or hear you read parts of this essay. So I know you've chosen an excerpt, so I'm going to go ahead and let you read that, and then I have some questions for you.
All right. I will get right into it then. All right. Right now, this is written in second person. So right now, you are standing on the lawn, looking in the direction your father will come, imagining where he might be, somewhere in Missouri, probably, flying down Interstate 35 in the gathering gloom, when you hear the garage door opening behind you. You start to turn, the first thought rushing through your head that your mother is about to call you in to go to bed because it is after 7 now. And even though you never bother her behind her closed bedroom door except to ask her to unlock the padlock on the refrigerator, it is your bedtime because she says it is your bedtime, because you need your sleep, because if you don't get your sleep, you will be out of control. You hear this a lot, this promise that you will be out of control if not for her intervention. You've heard it so much you accept it as true because she is your mother and you think she loves you and knows what she is doing, meaning you trust her over your own instincts, your own feelings. But she is not coming to tell you to go to bed. She appears around the back of her white Honda Civic, lugging a suitcase, which she heaves into the back. You are instantly confused. What is happening? Are we going on a trip? Is she going to announce we're going on vacation the moment Dad gets home? But this makes no sense. It is after 7, bedtime. Where could we possibly be going at night? And Dad isn't even here. She disappears back into the darkness of the house, then reappears with another suitcase. You slowly walk toward her, your instinct to help her load the suitcase, large like the previous one. You realize she is loading suitcase after suitcase, not just 2. Almost every piece of luggage your family owns, as much as will fit into her tiny subcompact Honda and still leave room for the driver and a front passenger. You won't know this then. You won't even remember this for years to come, the many suitcases. But if she were to open them, which she never does in front of you, you would discover them full of valuables. Jewelry, gold coins your father smuggled out of apartheid South Africa on a business trip in the early 80s. The fur coat your mother hasn't worn in years because she cares about animal rights. And about $20,000 in cash. You won't know until years later that she had spent that day cleaning out their joint bank accounts. You ask her what is going on. Initially, she doesn't answer you. Keeps running back to the house, emerging with another bag, then struggling to try and fit them into the back of her car. Taking one out and putting another in, trying to fit them like blocks until you can't see out the back. You stand there unsure what is going on, what you should be doing, if you should be helping. You sense that something is up, but you don't know what. She should be sending you to bed by now, but she isn't. You struggle to remember her exact words when she finally speaks. Was it, "I'm leaving your father," or was it, "We are leaving your father"? This seems important because the first statement is her choice. The second was making a choice for me. Although I can never know for sure, I suspect what she actually said was close to the second statement. Like she saw me not as an independent person, but an extension of herself. Like making me get naked in front of her and get down on all fours with my ass in the air while she inserted the enema tube was no different than doing it to herself. I was not a person. I was alive, but alive in the way a pet or a houseplant is alive. You can make choices for a pet or a houseplant. She doesn't pause, give you time to let what she's just said sink in, that she's leaving your father after 21 years of marriage across 3 continents. She continues that your father is on his way back, and when he gets home, he will be greeted by a process server who will hand him divorce papers. We have to go, she tells you. We have to be gone by the time he gets home. If he gets home and learns that we are leaving him, he will get violent. You are 13 years old and have no time to process what is happening. You want to process what is happening. Your first reaction is that you are not really surprised. In many ways, this seemed inevitable. Your parents have existed in an uneasy tension for years, a circuit always on the edge of breaking. All it would take was one little thing for the line to snap. And it finally has. You don't know exactly what the final straw was that broke the camel's back, but it doesn't matter. They were heading this way for years. Because of you? Maybe. Likely. And that is your second reaction. Relief, like you've been hanging on by your fingertips, dangling above the chasm, trying not to fall in. And your mother has had you feel the courage to finally call a spade a spade. She wasn't happy. Your father clearly hasn't been happy either. You can't remember the last time you saw either of them happy, at least together. But your father just lives in his frustration. He doesn't do anything about it. Your mother at least has the guts to cut the cord. And you are relieved because you think they will finally stop fighting over you. This strikes me as naive now, that they would not really fight over you anymore, as if you no longer existed, as if the end of their marriage erased you, erased the source of their conflict. It's heartbreaking. Yes, a lot of kids blame themselves for their parents' divorce. But I'm not sure they are really relieved when it happens. You were relieved, not just because you thought now that magically you would no longer be the irritant in their marriage, but because at 13, all you want is for your parents to be happy. Because maybe if they are happy, perhaps you can be happy too. It is like the only attention you ever get from either one is negative attention, and you desperately want to believe it will be different now because your mother is ending the marriage. But wait a minute. Your mother is still going, still hurriedly loading up the Honda, still trying to fit more in that the tiny car can hold. Why do we have to go? She is telling you that your father will become violent, that if we stay, she says, he will definitely hurt her. And she says, looking directly at you, he will probably hurt you too. She gives you no time to think about what possible reason your father would have to hurt you. She is insistent. There's no question. This is not a hypothetical. He will become violent. He might even try to kill us. He probably will try to kill us because he has before. You don't know that, but she tells you there's a lot you don't know about your father. He is not going to let us go. He will fly into a rage and he will kill us. Somewhere deep inside you, there is a feeling, the feeling that what she is saying about your father is wrong, but you don't understand. It doesn't sound like the man you know. You've never known him to lay a hand on your mother. Nor does she seem particularly afraid or panicked. She is telling you your father is going to kill both of you, both you and your mother, but there's no fear in her voice, no real emotion at all, like she's reading off the weather. But if it isn't true, why is she saying it? And if she isn't true, then that means she is wrong. And if she's wrong about this, what else is she wrong about? The padlock on the refrigerator, the colonic enemas, the food restrictions, everything else she's ever told you. And I'll stop there.
All right. Thanks a lot. That was wonderful. Okay, so I noticed you included a lot of detail from something that happened a long time ago. Is your memory that good?
No. And so I'm glad you asked that. So one of the things that I struggle with and I've always struggled with both as a writer and as a person is the feeling like well, not just the feeling, but that I don't remember a lot. In fact, there are whole periods of my childhood, even when I'm younger. I mean, I'm 48 years old now. Of course, I'm going to forget things, but even when I was younger, like in my 20s, I couldn't remember a lot. So the like for example, the loading of the car. I don't remember those exact details. So the major events within what I read, all that is true, but the details I've had to, I don't want to say make up, but I can't say for certain that those details are absolutely what factually happened.
Right. So in other memoirs, I mean, I've heard memoirists write things and say things like, "Boy, it has to be every exact fact, or you can't put it in." Would you call this a nonfiction memoir, or how would you what would you do?
Yeah, yes, I would still call it, because like for me, and I think, this is obviously a major topic in the area of memoir, but so things like dialogue, almost, well, pretty much any memoir has dialogue, right? But think back, do you remember, like, think back to a conversation you had yesterday? Do you remember exactly what was said, what you said, what somebody said to you? And we're talking yesterday.
I agree, and I've been trained in academic writing, and the way I was taught to look at it is when you quote something, it better be the exact quotes from a source or from speaking. So the idea of just guessing what it was, to me, if you want to be technical about it, the dialogue like that quoted is making it fiction because you didn't have the exact dialogue.
Yeah, and the thing is, I mean, if I wrote two things. One, if I wrote exactly what all I remembered, it would be pretty flat. It would be pretty lifeless. It comes to life, it wouldn't seem real. And what makes it real is those details that I don't remember. I mean, I don't remember whether it was one suitcase or 10 suitcases. I don't remember, like, the part where I said, she never opened the suitcases. I don't know how much of that is what I actually remember or whether it's what my father later told me, which is that she cleaned out the bank account. So those suitcases would have been full of cash, but I don't know that for certain. But the
Okay.
other thing is, I'm not doing it to like mislead the reader. I want the truth as much as the reader does. And this is my attempt to figure out the truth. So it's more like, I'm not saying this is the absolute truth. I'm saying this is my attempt to try and figure out my truth.
Okay. Well, I'm going to move on to the next question. As I mentioned in the last episode, the Shining experience, it was an amalgamation of real experiences, not all mine, rather than a purely factual retelling. Also, things I've heard from other people, like you mentioned, and combining things that happen at different times into the same scene. So, but you were talking to me earlier. I was talking to you, and you've mentioned that not knowing the details of your childhood frustrates you. And I'm just curious about, does it frustrate you because you do not know if or if not you suffered pain, according to the poem by Edna St. Vincent Millay? Or is it because it's hard to write your memoir because you can't remember? So is it
Mm,
because of the suffering trauma or because of the book or a little bit of both? Could you elaborate on that?
yeah, yeah. So the reason it has frustrated me, it's frustrated me both as a writer and as an individual, and it's frustrated me because I don't necessarily always know exactly what happened to me, or that's what I used to say anyway. And so one of the things that I've come to realize through therapy, through through step work, through writing is no, I can say these things did happen to me. But I used to want somebody else to validate what happened to me. You know, and the only people who could do that, my mother and my father, weren't going to do that. My mother doesn't talk to me at all. And my father, when he was alive, would get he'd get like so he'd get defensive, you know, anytime I brought up the past. And so I used to feel like, okay, did this really happen to me if no one else can validate the experience?
Yeah, I
And
get that about the
yeah,
frustration about that because for me, one of the reasons I went into some fictional parts, combining things that happened, is my recovering young child as well as my adult self needs to know for myself and for the world that this pain, this suffering, this trauma was what happened. And there's a sense that the world, I mean, it was a long time ago, so who cares? And so my desire is to bring out the spirit of what actually happened, and that's why I'm adding some of the fiction into mine or changing of time events and stuff.
yeah, well, like you have siblings, right? You have a sister, you have a brother. So like, have you ever, and I know you have because we've talked about it, like you now obviously the three of you had had some commonalities, but also some differences in terms of your experiences. But, you know, have you ever like tried to corroborate a memory with your either your sister or your brother? I'm guessing you probably have because we've talked
Well,
about
one of them was at the our trip to the Olympics because part of my story is about the freedom and fun I had as a child as well as the trauma. And during our trip to the Olympics, I almost tipped over our camper van when I was driving at 14 years old or 15 years old. And then when I told my brother, he thought he was the one who was the passenger who let me drive. And I did not think that at all. I was pretty sure it was the other guy on the trip, the other overage person. And so that one was one where it didn't really matter, but I kept in what I thought, but my brother thought, no, I was there. So yeah, there's a lot of little things like that.
yeah. And you know, see for me, and I think that this certainly in and of itself is not trauma, but I think it exacerbated my trauma. I was an only child. So, and that's also something that, you know, again, when my father was alive and I would ask him at various points, you know, why was I an only child? The story would change. You know, one time it was because, well, I wanted more kids, but your mother didn't. So he put it on my mother. And then when I asked him the same question years later, it was, well, you know, we just, you know, that was just what you did. You know, you got married, you had a kid. So, you know, and that was also part of my frustration too, was that I had nobody, you know, like you have, and I'm sure I'm romanticizing this a little bit, the idea that siblings can like remember your life for you, because obviously, you know, everyone's perception is different, but it was that feeling of like, can anybody remember my life for me? And what I've kind of come to realize, and it's been part of my healing, is that no one else actually can remember my life for me. I have to do it. And so my writing is really about my journey to saying definitively, yes, this is what happened to me.
Right. And part of my main reason that I would even visit this topic and write my book at all is because I've been in recovery for 37 years, worked the steps and been very committed to changing with therapy and lots of things, but still suffer from explosive kind of things sometimes, hypervigilance sometimes, and depression and anxiety. And so there's these things that, making it really difficult to recover. So here I am, my outward life is pretty stellar, but I'm still challenged. And so I look at the research and I say, wow, there's some connection. Trauma research is very clear about how that messes up our brain and makes it harder to just be happy, joyous, and free in the simple life. And so that's my big reason for looking, for being interested in this topic. And there's a lot of research on how memory, trauma affects memory. And the idea of writing a memoir or even just trying to remember what happened to us. Here's a quote from a book about trauma. It says, those experiencing trauma commonly experience difficulties in remembering, and that notions of quote unquote truth and historical accuracy are relative to those experiencing the events rather than objective memories. So these memory controversies function as a reminder that debates about truth and lies are
Mhm.
fundamentally irresolvable. And so that's the memoir question. For me, the recovery question is, I'm writing the book to help my recovery, help me remember the truth, but I jumped out a window in The Shining, and that's not real, and that sure felt good. I mean, I really felt that that was healing me in the moment of writing
Yeah.
it.
Well, I also think, I mean, for me, part of my struggle has been as you got to see a little bit in that excerpt that I read, where my mother's telling me all this stuff about my father. And what I didn't read was she goes on to say, eventually say my father is a hitman for the mafia and things like that, which, from this standpoint now, I go, well, that's laughable. My father was an electrical engineer. But, when I'm 13 and my mother is saying this with complete earnestness, and the problem was that when I was that age, I thought that if my mother was insane, somebody would actually tell me this. Somebody would say, "Hey, your mother's nuts." Mostly my father. Nobody ever did. So I'm like deeply conflicted by these things that my mother is telling me, but they must be true, right? Because if they weren't true, why would she say it? So she really kind of screwed with my sense of reality, and that's also part of, I think, what's made my journey to try and work through this very challenging. Like, did that happen? Did it not happen? Because I didn't have a strong sense of what reality was.
And let me ask you this related to that. Do you think that part of your frustration is that if you aren't sure, you might be blaming yourself subconsciously for not doing more to resist your mother?
Yeah.
And then if you're not even sure what the truth is, or she's messing with your sense of reality, that just you'd like to verify that it was like really difficult to be able to deal with that situation. But if you're not even sure what happened, it's tricky.
Yeah, and that was the thing is, I wanted and verify. I mean, I used to you've read about all these things that my mother did. Um and I used to want to email her, even despite all that, and say, did this actually happen? And it took me a long time to go, wait a minute, that is completely insane. I am asking the person who abused me to validate what happened to me. But this is what happens every day. People who suffer from trauma often want the validation of the abuser, and it's really hard to learn to and that's what I think we've been doing in these writing journeys, is validating and saying, hey, yeah, this happened.
Right.
And whether the person who did it, in my case my mother, in your case your father, whether they ever realize it doesn't matter. What matters is we know it happened.
Yes, that's good. And how are we doing on time, Michael?
We are probably getting to about the end here. Let me see. We should probably start wrapping up.
Okay,
Um,
great. All right. Well, I want to thank you very much for your new essay, and I've been reading it. It's wonderful, and I agree. I think the main point, really, what I'm getting here is that this writing is us claiming the abuse, us claiming the trauma, and not being victims to it. It gives us some agency in the trauma, and not about, you go ask your mom, and she's going to say, "No, Michael, you were just a little wimp." And you didn't do anything. It's like, why would
Yeah.
so we're claiming it. We are the
Yeah.
ones who are controlling
Yeah.
this.
And that's, that's something that I think we'll elaborate on in a future episode. But yes, it's not just about saying, why this happened to me. It's a sense growing up, like we talk about in recovery. What are we responsible for? What are we not responsible for? What is our part? What is not our part? And I think the writing is part of that process of being able to say, okay, what was our part? What is not our part?
Exactly. And my part of my writing is to show how dangerous my father was, and lethal and effective of a fighter. Part of that's because the emasculation that I experienced, not standing up for my mother or my brother, and being a cowering babe, a coward, and that is traumatic and adding to the trauma. And so the writing is making it very clear that he was impossible for a 13-year-old kid to try to stand up to. It would have been dangerous, too
Yes.
dangerous, maybe death. It would have been death, maybe. So, anyways, okay, well, thank you so much for talking to us about your new essay. And thank you for joining us, everyone in the audience, on Rising Above Trauma, Addiction, and Culture in a Crazy World for our second episode, Memory and Trauma. Look for our next episode coming in 2 weeks. And remember, the worst effects of trauma and addiction can be overcome, and recovery starts with a simple, honest conversation. Thank you. Bye.